Tobias, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I didn't listen to the translation, so I'm sure it was a very nice introduction. So I thought a bit after yesterday what I can sensibly contribute to this wonderful conference, and I have a dual background. I think, is it better? Yeah. Okay, I have a dual background in both philosophy and computing, so I'm trying to think what could be better in this day, and I try to now talk a little bit from my computing side and also show you that there are actually critical discourses of people in computing that you might be able to relate to. So talking about myself a little bit, so first I feel deeply honored by the introduction, allowing me here today to speak, and that is not only because I always like to come to Athens, but also I have a PhD student who's from Athens, and she was very impressed that I get an invitation by the Hellenic Authors Association, and it's always good to have PhD students who are impressed by your work, so thank you very much for that. Very kind. So I am a professor of AI and Humanities at the Institute for Logic, Language and Computation at the University of Amsterdam. And these are all very useful titles because they barely tell you already what I'm doing. Yeah? So I don't need to talk much more about myself. So what I really want to talk about in short is why our current AI is all of a sudden so keen on culture. And as my contribution is a bit from computing, I try to also move us slightly away from this heavily loaded term of AI and try to base this a little bit more into the actual things that we're currently doing, which many people actually claim, and we had that discussion earlier already in the morning keynote, claim is not really AI. Yeah? And this kind of thing came to me about a year ago when I attended a workshop at Darkstuhl. That is the German computer science retreat, very famous international. And at that retreat, there were also several people from the big industry labs in the United States who currently work on all these large language models that we are talking about here. And one of them showed this slide, and compared this moment that we are currently in with another key moment in the history of AI, or better actually machine learning. And that is in the mid-2010s when these AI systems had left the labs of the scientists and became used in things like mortgage applications, approving them. People started all of a sudden getting really worried, not just about the actual computational performance of these systems, but also about their societal impact, particularly around questions of fairness and bias that they expose. And Fernando, my colleague, then compared this with this moment when in the community of AI makers, there's actually a lot of concern about this relationship to culture. And why is this at this moment in time? And why is this? Well, if you think about these systems that we talk about so much now, generative AI, large language models, and so on, what else are there but basically gigantic sucking in machines of cultural material in general, and so on. And all their intelligence, all their knowledge comes from these kind of cultural materials. So that means that we also have to rethink a little bit how we understand the economy and society. Until very recently, we always talked about this idea of surveillance capitalism, so the idea that you hand over your data to your social media companies, and for that you can then use their services, and they basically surveil you and sell your data yourself to other people for marketing purposes. Yeah? And now I think at the heart of this new kind of these kind of generative AI imposed new economy and society, what is much more typical is this famous case that I'm sure many of you will know about, the 3 authors who sued Anthropic a while ago for copyright violations because Anthropic, the AI company, scanned their books without their knowledge. Yeah? And that also shows you very much what these companies are actually interested in. So I am not a writer in the narrower sense of the word. As I mentioned already a couple of times to colleagues here, I do write scientific text. And many studies show that these generative AI systems, these large language models, they don't like being trained on scientific text because they are too abstract and not particularly creative. Because they're designed around conversations that you have. So these generative AI systems, large language models, they're really keen on particular the kind of work that you are doing. So they're really interested in the kind of data that you are producing. And exactly this kind of relation is the topic of a project I currently have for about a year, which is called Deep Culture. So this project is about the relationship of culture with the underlying technology behind generative AI that also was mentioned yesterday already, which is called deep learning. And in the project, we not only try to understand the current state of things, so the cultural relations involved, but we also try to provide alternative way of processing and computing these things. So this title is a play with this idea that also was introduced yesterday already about digital cultures that many of us have been researching now for a very long time. And vaguely speaking, this means the kind of mediations of our identities, our communities, our memories through digital technologies, as well as also the records that we make about these things. Also, lots of research has been done in new cultures, so think about influencer cultures on Instagram and so on. And Deep Culture now says, this title of this project says, we continue with this digital culture, but it's really also a shift. And the shift is mainly that beforehand we had a number of different algorithms, data structures, and so on that did these things, and now we essentially have one way of doing it, which is the deep learning infrastructures. And that leads then to this massive expansion globally of digital culture production and consumption. So what is this deep learning? Well, there's no better way to find that out than to read a Nature article by the 3 people who won later on the Turing Award for this work that they did on deep learning, and one of them also won the Nobel Prize. And that is this article, and there's lots of very interesting information, but mainly this article is dominated by these diagrams that you see here on the bottom right corner. So you might have seen that before. These are so-called artificial neural networks. And they are vaguely inspired by the human brain, but maybe one lesson, if you take nothing home from today, they have nothing to do, very little to do with the human brain. So that's better, forget about that, right? What they essentially are these kind of nodes. Yeah, these are kind of these circles that are highly connected to each other. And these nodes are also called neurons in this language, but they are not particularly super smart. So the intelligence of the system comes from the connectivity of these nodes. Yeah? And it's very useful to understand how this would now address the problem of, for instance, writing a beautiful poem. In this case, the beautiful poem data would go from the bottom into the bottom, and then it interacts on the way through the network with all these nodes, and then it comes out on top. And there, the mathematical calculations that did about this beautiful poem is compared with some kind of ideal type mathematical representation of what the computer thinks a beautiful poem is. And the difference, or the error between these two things, are fed back through the network, and then these nodes are updated. So the main lesson here is, which is often very hard to understand for us who work in the humanities and also authors, this is never about the perfect, beautiful poem, but only always about an optimization, the best possible solution. It's an iteration of different approaches. And I cannot overstate how much this is a different, even for the same field, how different this is in terms of thinking. So let's take an example of something that is much easier to think in this way than beautiful poems. Let's say I would look at all the people in this room and I would want to model your height. Yeah? Only a couple of years ago, I would have done that the following way. I would have used the statistical knowledge that this height of population is distributed according to something called the normal curve. And then I would have just found the right normal curve to fit this particular people in this room. There are many issues with this kind of thinking. This is more like theory-driven thinking, so there's a certain regularities that I think about the world, which is in this case the normal curve, and then I try to model from there. And there are many issues with this thinking, and the first one is, of course, there are many things in this world where I at least can't say anything about these kind of regularities. And the beautiful poem, for instance, is one of those things, clearly not very easy to express mathematically. Here you see an example that is a bit easier to represent, which is distinguishing cats and dogs as images. Now, if you ask me as a human, I can easily do that, but if you ask me how I did this, it's much harder to say. And what we found out about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we can actually just throw a lot of examples of cats and dogs images at these neural networks, and then they do exactly what you can see here in this visualization. They start to activate different nodes and connections, and then represent this in some way that we don't really fully understand, but they're then able to discriminate these pictures. So if I say throw lots of examples at it, then it's always important to remember that this kind of AI revolution, or what we call now AI, is the dominant AI, is actually, the history of that is in the history of the discovery of big data, which I still remember. It's about 20 years ago that this paper came out, written by 3 very important people who worked then at Google, and they call this the unreasonable effectiveness of data. Yeah, so throwing stuff at something like these neural networks, and then something magical almost comes out of it, like being able to discriminate cats and dogs. And they celebrate this moment because all this data is now available on the internet, free for download, and then we can just train these kind of models. And that is actually continued in the thinking of these AI companies today. So this is the paper on top that made OpenAI and also Anthropic, because their claim is that I don't need to know much about theories about the world, how humans relate to each other. All I need to do is basically, I slightly exaggerate this now, all I need to do is make a big network, make an even bigger network the next time, throw even more data at it, and that is then producing always much better results. And this is the idea of scaling in this community. That's how they call it. Some people in the computer science community also call this, Rich Sutton is a very famous computer scientist, call this the bitter lesson. So where we had in the past all these theories about how translation works and so on, then we now have this one way of doing it, which is basically purely inductive, purely throwing kind of examples at these networks. Where there's a narrative, there's always a counter-narrative. Yeah, so within the same community of people, actually, the computer scientists, there was also always a critique immediately of this narrative of big data, and this often came from the same people who operated with these data sets for their practices. So for instance, if you worked in facial recognition or image processing, generally speaking, you knew that the earliest data sets in this domain were often mugshots by people who got arrested. These were simply the first kind of facial images that were available, but these were not particularly representative of the wider population. And that lives forth in the kind of current data sets and also in things like current text data sets. If you look a little bit into the prehistory of text processing, you often find in the 1980s in particular security applications, so finding terrorist behavior in early messaging boards, again, not particularly representative of the wider population. So what I wanted to say basically here, don't think that of the AI field as just one harmonious kind of, you want to make bigger system and, bigger language models. There's always been also critical AI, and particularly around data sets. And if you're interested in this, on the right-hand side, or my right-hand side, you can see the kind of current standard paper, Data and its Discontents, that has been published also open access, so you can read up on it. And then there are many more concerns. So the first one that you always have is, as I said already, we don't really know exactly how these neural networks make beautiful poems or kind of discriminate cats and dogs. So there's now a whole field of observing them, so to say. But there's, of course, a big concern. In a way, we created something that we don't really fully understand. So it's very intransparent how they make decisions. Then, particularly in this community, science is now ruled by big tech in Silicon Valley. So my colleague Fernando van der Vlis called this big AI. It's really a very small community of very rich people by now who determine in a way the future of our relationships to the machines. And in my institute, there's also always the big regret. Is this a model of throwing stuff at some neural network, at something that we don't even fully understand, and making AI? Is that really our imaginary that we had originally about AI? And I don't think so. Yeah, there's a lot of different alternative histories and theories of AI that have been completely covered up. But there's no bigger topic than the one actually we're discussing today, I would claim, which is this question of the future of creativity, or you can even say human expression in this world. And this is just a quick web search I did on AI art. Now, I don't want to judge whether this is beautiful or not. What is clear here, definitely clear here is that it's somehow a recombination of old things, old topics, old themes, and so on. And that's really what also I think was said in the morning already. So you need to think about this as a new or creative things that is a recombination of the old. That's all it can do, in many ways. And then there's immediately two questions that you can raise as a person working in this field. The first one is a bit more meta question, but it's really very actively researched currently. What happens to the new, so to say, in the future if it only ever is the recombination of old? And there are some real concerns that we're going to run out of recombinations in the future, and then there will be no more kind of creative expressions here. And the second one is exactly the topic of the conference here, which is that what happens to the people who created the original and all the effort that they made. Now I added this slide because it's about Sibylle Krämer, so I thought that would be nice. Before I now continue and talk about the kind of issues involved in exactly this relationship, I want to just also for a moment praise this. We criticize all of this, but it's a really interesting, unique moment in human history in the sense that if you only think about our relationship to machines, for the first time we are not just the passive recipients of AI, so we don't just consume web results or Netflix recommendations, but actually in a fairly normal way we can interact with these systems and create something new, and that is not just limited to experts like myself who work in this field. And Sibylle Krämer calls this a new Kulturtechnik. So I like that, so I thought I added this because there was lots of talk about Sibylle earlier, so that's good. Now coming back to the negative story then, the concerns. We also had a conference in December in Amsterdam, which was about generative AI and creative practices. It was slightly more from a perspective of media studies and economics and so on, but it was similar about the same topics that we talk about today, the future of creative labor and what this all does to us. And I now want to take the topics of this conference as well as my own practices to talk about what I think currently where we are and what we can actually currently do. And I should say I am a scientific writer but not a creative writer, so I choose a field that was also mentioned already by David yesterday where I know that I actually can sensibly talk about creative practices, and that is coding. And I do that almost every day. That's just part of my job. And I can say to you, only in this last, I would almost say 2 to 4 months, definitely not more than about a year, this creative practice of basically programming computers has fundamentally changed. And I want to talk about this a little bit now from the perspective of somebody who teaches people who often are not exposed to coding before I meet them, so humanities and social science people. And then you would have had, this would be a typical master thesis from about 3 years ago. I downloaded this from the internet, so it's not mine, but you can see here what they're trying to do. They're trying to basically analyze some online news sources, and then they use some tools that they have probably learned the hard way in all our studies to examine these online news sources from a particular theoretical perspective, which is in this case intersectional feminism. Now, and I would claim that all the green parts of this, now anybody, you can now do this, go to ChatGPT and it will produce you perfect code for this in no time. There's no problem to do this anymore. It will still struggle with data access because it changes a lot, and it will generally struggle with more complicated theoretical perspectives such as intersectional feminism. So what I want to say here, and I added the slide after I found out I've been invited because of this interview that I gave by accident almost. So what I want to say here is really this is a beautiful moment if you teach kind of people who have not been exposed to coding before. Why? Because they got much more quickly reach a certain level of expertise. And that means that they can actually do coding, programming, to a level that they can address real problems that they have, for instance, around datasets. While in the past, we barely taught them very basic knowledge, and then they more or less try to do their best with that. So this is how we should think about this. It's not about just replacing people, but lots of people will much more quickly have a much higher level of expertise. And that was the topic of an interview I gave about our book that had come out at the same time. And don't worry, I'm not going to start talking about the book now. That would be a whole different talk. It's about something very different. It's about algorithmic governmentality. But in that interview, as it's the case, these interviews, you then also talk about other things. In this case, what was going on in the world, in particular the screenwriters strike that they did in Hollywood. You remember that? It was about 2 years ago, against AI, among other things. And I then said something that I still would defend today. And that is that I would not be worried that these AI systems will anytime soon produce the highest fine art. They will not produce new Mozart stuff. But because they are the recombination of old things, so there's not really super creativity involved, as was also said in the morning. But of course, one should not underestimate where they can have a serious impact. I gave the example because of screenwriters, that whatever in the future, where you had now 4 people writing the 10th episode of the 50th installment of a sitcom, in the future, I think you will probably only need about 1 or 2 writers plus some AI tools. And this might not be fine art, but for lots of people, that's a bread and butter activity that actually they do. So this is, I think, a concern, and we should be thinking hard about this and how we address this in the future. But actually, my main concern, and that's really not something I don't think we have talked that much about here yet, is what this actually does to our creativity. And that is more founded in the kind of practices of these big AI companies, the generative AI companies, as well as our managers. And they sell us this stuff as super efficient, more productive, and all these other wonderful adjectives that they like to come up with to justify the billions of dollars of investment. And the problem here is, I think I related in that interview, I talked about some research we did at the same time with the Amsterdam University Hospital in medical AI, and that was very useful because they are, of course, in many ways very advanced. And what you could observe here is that this is not just a problem of kind of trust in AI, but also a problem of scale. So in those days, if you had a radiologist looking at scans of cancer scans and deciding whether you were, so say, whether there was cancer cells present, then that radiologist could have done it beforehand, maybe with 10 scans at the same time, and now they can do it with 100 or 1,000 scans because they got AI support. And that is great in many ways, but also it definitely requires much more labor. Yeah, so because you actually have to have many more people who have at least the level of expertise to check what AI systems come up with in these cases. So the efficiency argument is really a very bad one to think about the future of these labor relations. It's much more what this actually does to us and in which position that puts us in. And that's also what we discussed earlier, of course, in the translation panel. So let me come back now to what I think we should do, and I think this is because I'm invited here by an association of authors, what I think you could get involved in as an association. And that goes back now to our book again, where we not just analyze algorithmic governmentality, but also we analyze interventions we can actually do to work against these things. And we come up with 3 interventions in the final section. The first one is what we call resistance, which is essentially international solidarity. So you can work with the Hollywood screenwriters and work together with them. The second intervention we have is refusal. So I heard that yesterday, if I understood that rightly, also from politicians, there's a lot of talk about that AI is necessary and will just be there and cannot be avoided, so you better get used to it. And I think that's always wrong, right? Technology is just not necessary. We lived well beforehand. It's nice to have. And we should be able to say no to it. And we said in the book, mainly we talked about surveillance, but now you might have followed that debate. There's a very active debate around the militarization of these technologies currently. And I think we should all agree that in the future, we will never want any autonomous weapons, for instance. Yeah, that should just not happen. And then the final strategy is a bit what I want to discuss now, which is getting more involved with the discourses itself and understanding that these AI technologies are essentially very brittle and definitely don't do everything that they promised you to do. And we call that frictions in the book. And you can think about this as getting involved in the discussion and throwing some spanners into this equation. And at the end of my talk, I just want to quickly go to 2 sub-projects from this deep culture projects which try to add frictions to all of this. The first one is about frictions to the understanding of generative AI, and the second one is about frictions to the valuation of generative AI. For the first one, I think you do need some technical thinking and support. The second one, I think you can almost do now, if you ask me, after this conference. So as I said already, we don't actually fully understand, I think that's a community consensus now, how these neural networks exactly produce the knowledge that they produce, how they exactly work. So there are many people who consider them now to be empirical objects. There's lots of research being done to see how they work, to try and poke them, and so on. And I think the most famous work currently is done by Anthropic again, and that's essentially taking the human brain, and particularly neuroscience, as an inspiration. So the idea here is that in neuroscience, we know, for instance, that if we are happy, certain parts of our brains are activated. And you do the same thing for neural networks. It produces a racist poem, certain parts of the artificial neural network is activated. And then contrary to the human brain, you can try and stop these parts of this artificial neural network, you can untrain them. But this is, of course, all done to demonstrate for these companies how universal knowledgeable these machines are. And there's a counter movement in our community to actually show the non-knowledge that they have, the ignorance that they have. Yeah? So there's, for instance, an article that has come out by Kaiser Brill from Algorithm Watch, that's a Berlin-based NGO. And he asked these several language models about 200 dates that are most relevant to the world history. And what he then found out is, A, they have a hive mind. Yeah? And by the way, that's also the title of the Best Paper Award of the most important AI conference of this year. And what is meant by the hive mind is, so there are all kinds of different companies involved, and even cultures and countries in these large language models. They more or less produce the same knowledge, if you ask them. And why is that? Because they produce on the same data sets. And the second one, the second insight that he had is that they're quite bad at especially what I think humanities and historians and authors are interested in, which are the specific small relationships. And he did that all by just prompting them and then finding out their answers. And we are now trying to look under the hood, so to say, and investigate exactly how these neural networks activate knowledge and what kind of part of the neural networks are activated if they talk about things that are very known to them versus things that are not so known to them. So that's the first sub-project. The second one is a bit more advanced. It's currently under review, the paper, so wish us luck, that is going well. Review is quite terrible in life. And that is talking a bit about how these AI systems are valued. Okay? So I think, again, to say you need to think about these things as very complex. It's very hard to see what the differences are between them. And we need to have forms of valuation. And it's also inspired by, this work is inspired a little bit by what we call the DeepSeek moment. I don't know whether you remember this, but exactly about a year ago, we had this Chinese company, DeepSeek, coming along and putting a big dent into the everlasting American dominance in this field. And they said we can produce very capable, equally capable large language models for much less money. And how can they say that they produce very capable, equally capable large language models? Well, they use so-called benchmarks. Yeah? And benchmarks, you can imagine, they're very important in computer science, have a long history. They're essentially data sets, objectives, and so on, that we give these large language models to see how they perform. And then they could show that for much less money, they have the same kind of performance as whatever OpenAI. And in the paper, we talk more about what we think is then how these benchmarks enrich these arguments around generative AI, how they make these multi-billion-dollar companies, how they're also related to what we talked earlier about artificial general intelligence, because they are a bit the moment that we can see now how we reach artificial general intelligence in the future, and what the problem with that, all of that is. But I don't want to go into the details of the paper. I do think that, particularly now that I know that Greece also builds its own large language models, it's good for you to get involved in these benchmarks debates, if you ask me. That's definitely something you can do straightforwardly and understand a little bit how this discourses of the ever-expanding capacities of these large language models is formed and also critiqued. Yeah, lots of people have developed critiques of these benchmarks as not particularly relevant to the real world. And I can just show you what I found last week, which are the creative writing benchmarks that they basically use to say we are super creative. And if you just look at these benchmarks, you see already It's not entirely clear what they're doing, and they definitely all do some mathematical representation of what they think is creative. For instance, the length of a text. Now, if you ask me, that's not necessarily a good indicator of what creativity is. And actually, fellow communities, in this case marketing professionals, have already started getting involved exactly with these debates to demonstrate that maybe these large language models are not so large in their capacities. And all these two tools that I've just given you basically interrupt what I said about earlier, which is this idea of the unreasonable effectiveness of these systems. Yeah? And I think there is much more kind of friction, fragility, and so on in these kind of claims. So that's really what I tried to tell you today. The first one, I want to just say to you that at least at this moment, this AI needs you more than you need it. Okay? That's clearly the case. Not sure whether that will last forever, of course. Then don't get yourself being talked into this unreasonable effectiveness. Don't just be impressed by these things. Try and investigate them. And then try and get involved in actually making claims against these things and creating frictions. For instance, understanding how they don't know things, or actually understanding how things are valued based on very difficult assumptions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Tobias, for the very insightful and very thought-provoking talk, and also for the proposals that you raised, which is the most important thing that we are here to discuss. Περνάμε τώρα στο κομμάτι της συζήτησης. Ο Tobias μας βοήθησε λίγο να καταλάβουμε καλύτερα γιατί δεν μας ενδιαφέρει μόνο γενικά η τεχνητή νοημοσύνη, αλλά μας ενδιαφέρει συγκεκριμένα η μηχανική μάθηση και η βαθιά μάθηση ως το πυρηνικό ζήτημα των μεγάλων γλωσσικών μοντέλων, που βέβαια αφορούν εμάς ως συγγραφείς, μεταφραστές, δημιουργούς λόγου. Και παράλληλα ακολούθησε την ομιλία του με κάποιες συγκεκριμένες προτάσεις, τις οποίες βέβαια μπορούμε και να συζητήσουμε όλες όλοι μαζί. Θα μας βοηθήσει η Ζωή με το μικρόφωνο και ερωτήσεις, σκέψεις, παρεμβάσεις.
Μία ερώτηση ενδεχομένως παιδαριώδη, αλλά αναρωτιόμουν. Αν τα απευθυνθούμε στα μεγάλα αυτά γλωσσικά μοντέλα, συγκεκριμένα λέγοντας ότι εγώ θέλω μία σελίδα λογοτεχνικού κειμένου με αυτά τα δεδομένα. Να είναι λυρικό κείμενο, να είναι έτσι. Αυτό σημαίνει ότι σε οποιοδήποτε μέρος της γης θα παράγουν το ίδιο κείμενο, εφόσον είναι εκπαιδευμένα από το ίδιο, με τα ίδια data.
Without the microphone, there's no translation. So, very good question that I actually forgot to address. So, these are stochastic knowledge machines. So they always actually produce different outputs. So whenever you type something in, they will produce something different. It is just that the basics of their knowledge all come from the same kind of level of understanding, if you see what I mean. So the problem is almost the other way around, yeah, that they are always different in their outputs. They will never produce exactly the same kind of words, or more or less, that's clearly the case. They will always produce something else. But that's just because of the way that they are set up as random machines, essentially. Yeah? But the knowledge they base these answers on is basically based on the same kind of corpus of knowledge. That is meant by this artificial hive mind. Yeah? So they will, for instance, in this case, give you very similar rankings of the 200 most important events in human history, while they forget, for instance, about the fall of Angkor in Cambodia, because that's not simply knowledge they have. Yeah?
Do you see the future that the models could invent something, or they will limit it to the data mining and combine of them?
So, I mean, I do not think they will invent something in the radical word of invention. So if you ask me, will they create a completely new way of doing art, I would rather say not. And that's simply because they recombine old things. And the way that they do this, actually, I think it was a bit said earlier, but they actually compress representation of the current reality. And they try to sample from this compressed representation of the current reality whatever they produce as new things. Yeah? So there's several limitations towards that. However, why I was now critical about saying they make something new, I mean, lots of people recombine old things to make something new, or there's also some randomness involved. So I do not want to now negate that they will ever say something that surprises us very much. Yeah? So that's also, of course, happening.
So the next question is, do you consider an author, for example, an inventor or a data engineer?
Do I consider an author an inventor or a data engineer?
Yes. Do you think that the author is inventing a world, is inventing something when writing something, or is just combining data just to recall reality?
So, I mean, I'm not great at this distinction between high and low art, if you want to call it like this. So, probably both at different moments in time. I mean, let's be serious. Lots of my writing is based on brilliant ideas that I want to communicate to the world, but also things that are more labor and I work myself through various things. Is that, yeah?
Thank you for your talk. At the end, you have a message that AI needs us more than we do, at least for the moment.
Yeah.
At least for the moment, because there are not so much data, especially from several cultures or low-resource languages, for example.
Yeah.
And as we have more and more research infrastructures, like Clarin or Daria, for digital humanities, and we provide data to AI all day, every day, and more for research, low-resource languages. What do you think, as a scientist, we should do with research infrastructures? Should we continue on the same track and share data?
Did you know that I actually set up Daria a long time ago? I don't know whether you know this. That I worked with the Academy of Athens a while ago, so I can now talk a little bit about, or help set it up, right? I was one of the people. So I think, and I have actually reflected on what we claimed there. So we claimed a lot of open science, to basically publish the things that we are doing so that not just scientists can participate in our world. But what the disadvantage of that was always in a way that we handed over our products freely to the people who really rule the internet. In those days it was Google. We had already lots of discussions. For instance, I forgot now if you're the National Library of Greece, you publish the stuff online. The person or the institution that benefits most in that case is then Google, because they can find all the stuff, and then nobody looks at your site anymore. And that has, of course, radically even changed now, to say, with the kind of ingestion of all these materials into these large language models. And I do not know whether that was all such a good idea in those days. I still think that's an important contribution we made to things. But for instance, also as a coder, these machines would have never been so powerful as they currently are about coding, if not coders would have been one of the communities for the last 30 years now, which basically share all kinds of code advice, how to change things online. What this all means for you, I think I was asked that in my newspaper interview that I did, to say, which was a very nice experience, because I think you do have a Greek national initiative to make a language model, a Greek national language model, which is a very notable and important effort, exactly for the reason that you say. It's a low-resource language. I mean, lots of important writing in Greek, but not so much, right, compared to English or whatever. So it's something you should support. At the same time, it also takes away the stuff that you're doing, and gives it basically to other people. And I do think exactly the strategies that I mentioned at the end, I would mainly address this to these people who are actually creating this large language model at this moment in time, and trying to talk to them about the limitations and also your own rights when you actually do these kind of things. Beyond kind of big AI in Silicon Valley and so on, the US Americans. But I do think you can get into a dialogue with the people who are trying to do these efforts, because they also do it generally for good reasons, because they're in a similar situation, right? It's not like that science or computer science is also taken over by these large language models at this moment in time, and not a lot of effort gets back to Greece. So that's mainly my talk there. So it's a kind of yes-no answer. I'm sorry for that, right? Yeah?
Ναι. Λένε ότι τα τελευταία μοντέλα, τα τελευταία LLM έχουν γράψει μεγάλο μέρος του κώδικα.
Sorry.
Okay. Ναι, ναι. Wait.
Thank you. I'm not used to you speaking. Yeah.
Okay. Λένε ότι τα τελευταία μοντέλα των LLMs, ChatGPT και άλλα της Anthropic, έχουν γράψει μόνα τους μεγάλο μέρος του κώδικα που χρησιμοποιούν. Και ότι μελλοντικά, στο κοντινό μέλλον, θα γράφουν μόνο τους όλο τον κώδικα με το οποίο λειτουργούν. Το έχετε ακούσει αυτό και θεωρείτε ότι υπάρχει κάποιο όριο εδώ πέρα που ξεπερνιέται και μπορεί να μπαίνουμε σε μια φάση όπου με κάποιο τρόπο τα LLMs αυτονομούνται? Υπάρχει γενικά αυτός ο κίνδυνος της αυτονόμησης, του να κάνουν δικά τους πράγματα χωρίς να τους τα έχουμε ζητήσει?
Thank you for this small question. This is very important. So what is right is that we are, of course, in an interesting moment in this world where, in a way, these models try to program themselves. That's definitely the case. I am not working in these companies, but I do trust them when they say that whatever 50% of their code is now produced by these models themselves, and I can believe that easily. However, there is a problem with this, which is a kind of theoretical problem, which is exactly to say that these code bases are essentially on what is existing code. That's what they learned. All these models learn on the past. And that's exactly what I meant with the recombination of the old. So they produce something new and interesting, but will they ever be able to completely reprogram themselves to react to new situations? At the moment, there is very little evidence for that. And in fact, there's a whole theory that had also been reported very much in the news about a year ago, which was called the model collapse. And the model collapse was essentially the idea that not just code, but they also make their own data now. They make synthetic poems, so to say, synthetic poems that are then ingested. And then people could show that over the time of these model developments, the more and more synthetic data or synthetic code they had, the more they actually produce, the less good output, the worse outputs they produce, which was called the model collapse. Now, I do think that theory was a bit radical with the model collapse, but I think it's definitely the case that people are always trying to combine human input and synthetic input now. That's the lesson of this. So there's really we can really observe that these models not necessarily get better by just synthetic input. So I don't think in short this will happen anytime soon. I think we should much more be worried about things that can already happen, if you ask me, which is there's really no reason why a machine cannot decide to kill you. That is really not a problem for these machines. That is also the moment before. And I do worry a lot. I don't know whether you followed this news in the thing with Anthropic and what the Pentagon demands from Anthropic. I think this should all really concern us. And whether they are then super smart in killing you, I don't know. But I think that is not really important to you at that moment in time when you are shot by a machine.
Okay, about the future too, like I agree to the worries, and just today Anthropic is out of the game, and OpenAI is in. They already made a contract.
Grok, it's worse.
And Grok already. But the future of large language models, how do you see that? It seemed like you were arguing that there is still progress, even though people say it's the end and the technology hits a wall. And there was a rapid progress for a long time, or a long time in that is like 3 years. But now that all the data is ingested, apart from like some languages like Greek, which could be important to catch up here and could lead to progress, but there's so much data ingested already, and when the data is exhausted, we cannot build just on new data. There's going to be this problem with contamination and the self-produced data. So the progress won't be as easy in the future. But do you think that there's still a lot of space left for like improvement of algorithms or new methods that will be developed in the near future?
So very briefly, your last point, actually, we should always be aware that these algorithms haven't actually changed a lot, at least since 2017, right? The same architecture has been with slight variations. So it's a typical kind of computer science move. And I think what you're asking about is very much whether the scaling approach, which is essentially throwing more stuff at ever bigger models, will produce the same kind of results in the future. So I do not really know, I must admit. So every time somebody says that's the end of scaling, some of these companies comes with a new model that seems to be contradicting this. And even people who are saying were quite skeptical of scaling beforehand now say this work seems to work very well. Yeah, so we haven't seen the end of scaling yet. So I would be a bit skeptical about this argument. Where we have the end of data, I don't need to say that to you because you said that already in many ways. There is a lot of data or activity out there that we simply haven't got in any of these models yet. And I think before that is happening, I can't really say that there will be the end of data because that would really assume that the world is just what we call the West, right? Which is essentially what we currently have in these models. Yeah.
Δώστε μας ένα λεπτό γιατί δεν ακούνε οι μεταφραστές.
Οι θρησκείες θα επηρεαστούν, τα πιστεύω, ο φανατισμός των ανθρώπων θα επηρεαστούν ή θα αλληλοεπηρεάσουν. Τι θα γίνει το πράγμα και κάτι πρέπει να ανακατωθεί και εκεί, ας πούμε. Γιατί η τεχνητή νοημοσύνη θεωρώ πως δεν θα έχει θα δείξει μια ευλαβικότητα ή μια πίστη, φανατισμό, όλες τις θρησκείες, όχι μόνο ορθόδοξες και ανορθόδοξες. Γενικά.
Yeah, I mean, did you see I can make a lit. There was this AI agents that have now their own social network. I don't know whether anyone saw that news, and they made a religion once they could communicate with each other. However, it was then found out that it was actually the humans poking them to have religions behind it. So I am still quite more worried about humans, I have to say. I mean, living with them now for almost 50 years of my life, I think they are quite difficult too. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for all the answers.